and here's another episode of my podcast, All Things Conflict, and I'm your host, Maria Arpa. And today's episode, I'm bringing somebody rather special called Fabian Sharp. Fabian is the CEO of the South Kilburn Trust in London, and that's just part of a continuous 30-year career in which he has a passion and a desire to see local community lifted up. Fabian's focus has been on community development, and he really believes that if we work together and we lift each other up and we find ways to collaborate, to cooperate, to dialogue with each other, to find peace with each other, then we can truly change society rather than relying on government and politicians to do it for us. So I'm really excited about what Fabian has to say, his experiences, how he brings it all together. So let's jump into this conversation. Thank you. Fabian, welcome to All Things Conflict. Thank you for doing this. So we've sort of been in conversation on and off for several years. We've sort of circled around each other's environments, working in communities and with youth and conflict and all those sorts of things. I know you have a vast amount of experience. So I'd love to begin by you just introducing yourself and, things that you've done and some of the experiences you've had and, and what's important to you.
Oh, well, thanks, Maria, for having me on the show. Yes, you're right. We've known each other for quite some time, on and off. I guess connected by our shared space. We both sort of gravitate from time to time around Northwest London. I've seen peaceful solutions growing and taking rise in different parts of the community that I hold very dear. I have personally grown up in a number of different communities, although I was born in Paddington, and that's probably the closest Northwest London is to a real community that I call home. But I've actually lived in sort of rural England, in a village. I've lived in Cuba, in Italy. I've lived in West Africa. So I've seen different communities expressed in different ways, both in, as I say, rural communities and very urban ones. And what fascinates me is how those communities survive, thrive, and sometimes struggle. And I suppose my work has taken me to try and apply the lessons that I've learnt about community in my backyard, and that's how we've come into contact because I worked for a while for Paddington Development Trust, so a community development trust covering the north of the Westminster area, North Paddington. I then started working for a youth charity called the Avenues Youth Project, which is based in and serves the community of kind of Mozart, South West Queen's Park, but in the Westminster area along the Harrow Road. And latterly, I've taken on the role of chief executive at the South Kilburn Trust, which is also a community development trust, and which finds itself, or some parts of the community find themselves in conflict with the very community that I was working with previously across the road in Queen's Park and Harrow Road. So it's learning the lessons of how we build a thriving community, particularly in challenging economic times. But in some of these communities, it's been challenging economically for a very long time. And so therefore, what are the things that we can do to try and help those communities to stand on their own two feet, to find the conditions to be able to thrive despite the challenges. So that's what I'm most fascinated by, and what I've spent the best part of my working career to date doing.
Yeah, it's really lovely to hear that you've moved around and, been to other cultures, other countries, and that you're doing it back in your backyard, which is, it's been very dear to my heart and sort of echoes kind of what I did when I brought all this work back to sort of Kensal Rise area, Harlesden, northwest London area, Kilburn. Um, and you talk about challenging times and, money issues and poverty and the sorts of complicated and complexities of civil society today. And what that really sparked in me was remembering, one of the many things that I've been known for is neighbour disputes in social housing. And I remember that when I first started doing this work, some sort of 30 years ago, the kinds of conflicts we were called to mediate were noise, rubbish, parking, children, all the sorts of normal tensions of putting people onto housing estates, and making them live close together that you would expect. Okay, that's pretty standard stuff. But I noticed that as time has gone on, the problems are much more complex. Much more complex. You're talking about real deprivation. You're talking about, mental health issues. You're talking about things that used to have containers. There used to be places for people with mental health issues. There used to be reliable places. I mean, there are still places, but resources are too stretched. There used to be resourced places for addictions and the kinds of problems that people had. And now those resources are far too stretched, and people are having to sort of roll about and manage this stuff, and that comes out in violence and criminality. And not that I like the word criminality, but violence, abuse, dealing in stolen goods, joining gangs, moving weapons around, and these kinds of deep, dark issues that you cannot boil down to a neighbour dispute.
No.
And so I'd be interested in your opinion on that.
Well, I think the neighbour disputes continue,
Yes.
and I don't think they'll ever go away. But I think things have become significantly harder in communities to navigate. We talk about care in the community, and what I think is that, as you rightly point out, a lot of services that might still exist in some shape or another simply don't have the same resources that they did. There once were many more police on the streets, or you'd see them more often, or at least that's the impression we have. Mental health services, if you're a young person lucky enough to have a diagnosis, the chances of getting access to CAMS services are really slim. And if you don't know how to navigate the system, if English isn't your first language, that's going to be tougher still. Plus, you put into the system the fact that the system can be discriminatory, and that we often have sort of Eurocentric biases to the way that services are delivered, and that can often exclude others. And in the context of how we then create resilient communities who are able to withstand these growing pressures, it's really important that we understand what kind of tools are at our disposal to ensure that we really do justice to this question of equity, to lifting up those people who have the least, who have the very slimmest access to pulling any levers that might influence their services that affect their lives. And we talk about restorative justice and reconciliation and social justice, and sometimes these things actually come into conflict with each other, because you can bring two parties together around the table to try and negotiate a settlement and some peaceful solutions. But the truth is that you're often talking about a very big discrepancy in the power dynamic that exists around between those two parties or three parties. So we're really laying on the community a big responsibility to soak up the challenges that the post-war consensus, which once sort of we bought into, which meant that we paid our taxes and services would be delivered and we'd go about contributing to the local economy. That trust in that consensus has broken down, and for many people, it feels as though they're not getting anything in response. They're shouting into a void, and this creates, I mean, we've all had the experience of trying to get through to some service or another and being stuck on a interminable telephone automated system with, punch this and that and do the other, and all you feel like doing is punching a wall. And if on top of that you're struggling because your autistic child is not getting the care that they need, or your disabled child hasn't had the stair lift installed and you're having to carry them up, it becomes almost impossible to navigate the system, and it's totally understandable that people are feeling disillusioned by it. So looking to try and find some semblance of hope in all of this is really challenging. You talk about serious youth violence, and that is probably a sort of logical consequence of the problems that we're creating. And those problems are not all of failed service delivery and reduced budgets. They're a complex combination of economic factors for sure, but also overlay on that the extraordinary rise in mental health issues that have occurred and can be attributed to the advent of mobile phones and particularly social media, and how that's affected young people, how it becomes increasingly difficult as a parent to parent your child when actually a lot of that parenting is being outsourced to stuff that's happening online that they have no idea about. And so there is a fear in our communities. There's a fear that adults feel about their future. There's a fear that they fear for their own children, and that is passed on to the young people. And those young people often go about, particularly in urban environments like London, wearing a mask of armor, but underneath it, they're trembling with fear.
That's really, I mean, everything you said just makes total sense to me, because this areas of division and separation, they don't help. I mean, what was going on for me as you were talking, I was saying, well, yeah, what you do is, if people turn on each other, people at a certain level in society turn on each other, then there are people up here who can just get on with whatever misdemeanors and whatever they want to get on with, because everybody's so busy fighting each other at the level at which none of those people are ever going to become wealthy, rich, or escape the ghetto. And so for me, it's like, what are the vested interests in rabble rousing? In what are the vested interests in keeping people in separation and division? How does it benefit anybody? I mean, that's what I fail to see. That, yeah, okay, so you mentioned far right and, the immigration issue. So, let's just go to the worst possible outcome. And the immigration issue is, people are banned from coming here or they're removed. It doesn't solve tension and conflict between people. That will just shut off one thing, but it won't cure the basic dissatisfaction that people are feeling. It will just move to the next thing.
Yeah. I mean, although I profess to live by, the think global, act local philosophy, the truth is what goes on at a global level I find quite difficult to understand and to follow, and what the possible reasons might be for the kind of the global order to want to seek to sow division and hatred and confusion, leading to war and all the other things that we see going on around the world at the moment. Is sort of beyond me. I mean, it's sort of one of the failings of the human of human nature, is that I guess greed and so on can sometimes tip us across into the sort of survival of the fittest mode. Whereas I think there's also a whole other strand of philosophy, which is that we've actually succeeded and survived as a race because as a human race, because of our ability to work together, to support each other, and to be kind to each other, and through adverse times, whether that was fighting off saber-toothed tigers or, the Battle of Cable Street. There are there are there are abilities in human beings to do both of those things. What I think is that the at a neighborhood level, we have an opportunity to model behaviors which can, if you like, provide some means of protection against the influences that are bombarding us now into our telephones, into our screens, into our daily lives. But actually, it's those are virtual connections, and I'm talking about the real connections. How many times have you walked down the street in Kensal Rise or wherever it is and been mugged? Have you experienced that sort of thing personally? Should you be fearful of your neighbours? Can you in fact, overcome that assumption that people around you are somehow inherently dangerous? And can we talk to each other? And can we start that conversation and learn about each other? And I think those opportunities are where neighborhoods and communities really start. And often the kind of the infrastructure that enables those connections to happen have been eroded. Youth clubs have been defunded, schools have been privatized, communities aren't just sort of, in their neighborhood naturally forming. We have to create opportunities for those interactions these days. And since COVID, we've all become a little bit more antisocial, I think,
Mm.
and the idea of going and socializing with people. There's been, a huge reduction in the number of cultural spaces, music spaces in London where people can go and be and share and learn together. So I think, you know, as a kind of community builder, I don't know what the right word, how I would describe myself, but as somebody who cares about community, I think that one of the critical things is that we are able to provide a space where people of different experiences and backgrounds can come together. Now, whether that's going to actually happen naturally in a park is unlikely. Of course, we
Mm.
want parks to happen. So maybe it's also about not just the infrastructure, but it's about who's providing the oil to enable those relationships to actually happen. And there's some fantastic projects out there. You'll have heard of the Human Library Project, where you can instead of taking out a book to read, you can be invited to an actual human being's home, and they'll cook you dinner in the style of their original heritage. So you can find out what it means to be an Iranian in London, and somebody who's escaped Tehran, or who's here or studying or wherever it might be. And we can learn about each other in those interesting ways. Now, I'm not suggesting we all, flock to the human library, because there probably aren't enough volunteers to cope with it all. But I think it's about what I've found in all of the communities that I've lived in, whether that's in, like I say, Havana, West Africa, Gloucestershire, Central London. They are there have been the success and failings of those communities that I've lived in have all been based on the relationships, the actual human relationships. Sometimes they're good, and where it fails, usually it's because they're not. And so the question then is, how can we build those relationships to be better, to be more understanding of each other, to be less fearful of each other, and enable those realities to be modeled in practice, so that we can challenge some of the assumptions which are being you know put to us as though they're inevitable things that are coming our way. Most of us are pretty sensible, and we do want to get on with our neighbours, because if we don't, that's going to have a direct impact on us. So if we start at that kind of very hyper local level and look at what it takes to create those opportunities for meaningful engagement and understanding, then I think we have a better hope for the country and ultimately the world. If everyone is lighting fires in their little communities, beacons of hope and success, then those will multiply. I'm not working at the United Nations trying
Mm,
to provide kind of
mm,
international solutions to this. I'm looking at how communities around the world and under our noses have done some amazing things to come together. So previously, when I was working in North Paddington with Paddington Development Trust, I was a neighbourhood manager for the Queen's Park ward, and in that neighbourhood, residents had ever since the beginning of time voted Labour in what had ever since the beginning of time been a Conservative run local authority. So there was a huge democratic deficit there. It didn't matter, what happened. The people of that quite deprived part of North Westminster and quite overlooked couldn't get anyone to take their cause seriously in a position of power.
mm,
So they organized. They organized over decades. They've been organizing. First, it was the around the Homes for Votes campaigns that saw residents take ownership of their housing estates, which was a huge win. Then the establishment of the Development Trust itself, which came out of this process, and numerous other community organizations, arts organizations, cultural organizations, a really vibrant set of voluntary and community sector organizations sprung up in the absence of a state to provide these services in this community. So there's an example of people working together collaboratively to be able to find their way out of the problem that they find themselves in. And even better, in that neighborhood in Queen's Park, having worked for about a decade as the neighborhood manager, doing interesting things with the community, hopefully delivering things that they found were improving their quality of life and involving them in the decisions around that. When eventually, the funding for that particular project was at risk and was about to be turned off, we worked really collaboratively with the residents who'd been involved up until that point to say, well, look, if we can't do it, with you and for you, is there a chance that you can do it for yourselves? And there was a really fascinating period of time in which the residents, really explored whether they would be able to do this on their own. And the what they came up with was, yes, we can do a lot of it on our own, but actually we also need some help, but we want
mm.
to be the agents of that. So what they created in Queen's Park was the very first and so far only hyper-local layer of local government in London that sits below the local authority level, so that in fact with tax raising powers, and that community in Queen's Park every year now has a budget that they raise from themselves, which is raised with council tax. It stays in the local community and they can use it to fund the things that are important to them.
Oh, well, that's really good to hear. And of course, South Kilburn Estate is very dear to my heart. It was a place that I did a lot of work in 2004, 2005. I mean, drugs were the cheapest of anywhere in London. And so it was a place that people came from all over London, and residents was terrified to leave their houses, and the police had basically stopped going there. I mean, it was very desolate. So, and that was kind of in the middle of the New Deal for communities, which was unfortunately a terrible failure. And we did some amazing work, but when, as you say, there has to be support. So I remember what we did. We did a door knocking exercise, and we literally just knocked on doors and just started engaging people in dialogue. Some people that I'd trained that lived in the community to take the temperature. I trained a cohort of people as local mediators, local facilitators, to start working on some of the obvious disputes. And then one event that we did was we did a sort of speed dating thing for tenants, where we had one circle of people sat there and the other circle moving round. And it really helped, because there were some elderly people. And at the end, some of the young people were saying, oh, I was watching like who was coming up 3 people and thinking, oh, there's no way I can talk to that old lady. We'll have nothing to share. And they did, and they connected. And lots of people said, as a result of tonight, I'm not scared to walk across the estate anymore, which was
I mean,
amazing.
that's evidenced. The more
Yeah,
people you know in your
yeah,
neighborhood, the safer you are. In fact, the
yeah.
more children are playing outside your home, the safer your home is. So banish them at your own peril is
And
what
then yeah, and then I did a project in South London, so I'm not a stranger to housing estates and the issues and problems. Um, where what we did was we took it, so it was more than one estate. It was for a particular housing association, and they had an antisocial behaviour panel made up of residents. But of course, the people that are going to join the panel are all the angry residents who think everyone's doing everything to them. So what I did was I took them and I trained them all to be tenant listeners, and it completely changed their perspective of how they were viewing antisocial behaviour. So they went out and did a huge listening exercise on their various estates, drew out some of the conflicts that were going on, had experience of mediating those conflicts, and then started forming their own groups and committees
Yeah.
of saying, well, this is how we want to live together. The problem I found, as you described, is then when the funding goes away, it's not even the funding. When you're doing this work as a charity, you're reliant on the gatekeepers, and then they change job or they leave, and the next person comes in, and they don't want to inherit someone else's project, or that's not their priority. And I mean, certainly South Kilburn had its share of issues, one being that one CEO was discovered to have been using a social housing flat as a sort of pied-à-terre, and then that was followed by somebody who ended up having criminal convictions for something different but still related to community. And then what happens is the community lose faith.
They lose. Rightly so. I think that's right, and I think building back that trust
Yes,
becomes harder and
bloody
harder each
harder.
time. I also think that society has changed over the course of the last 20 years.
Mm,
Things are not where they were before. I talked about the post-war compact. I think lots of things we've lost trust and faith in,
mm,
whether that's institutions that were previously untouchable, the church,
mm-hmm,
monarchy, a whole range of different things that we previously just sort of bowed our heads to. We're not prepared to do anymore, and I think light is being shone all over. But I think what that also has got the capacity of doing is making people fearful and mistrusting, even where that's not warranted. So overcoming that is particularly difficult. And when you overlay on that sense of kind of personal trauma
mm,
that so many people feel, whether that is because they've literally lost a loved one to knife crime, or whether it's because
mm,
they've been living in a substandard home and they've been, as I said before, shouting into the void and nobody's doing anything about it. After 10 years, you've still got mold,
mm,
damp in your thing, and you're
mm,
developing a breathing condition as a result. You should feel both indignant, but you will be traumatized. Now, there's a question about how do we take a community that is so damaged and expect them to suddenly find within the capacity, the generosity of spirit to simply forgive and move on. And so there are tools at our disposal, whether that's around reconciliation, whether it's around restorative
mm,
justice. Um, but I think there's also there's also a need to recognize that sometimes, and I think there's a more relatively recent sort of field of study into this, which is that post-traumatic responses aren't always um, expressed through disorder. They can
yes,
actually lead. They
yes,
can actually lead to growth,
yeah,
and there's inevitably there'll be something that's particular to the individual that will determine whether their reaction to that trauma is more likely to be manifested in a negative way or indeed in a growth way. But I believe that we can take it at a kind of community level. We can try and put in the inputs that will help to edge people towards seeing that we can both acknowledge where there have been serious, not just
Mhm.
failings, but injustices, criminal
Mm.
activity, all sorts of things which the community have suffered, and there needs to be acknowledgement of that. We need to recognize people's experiences, but we need also to be able to move on so that we're not constantly re-traumatizing each other and ourselves as a community, and not allowing ourselves to move forward to a better place, which is where
So,
actually we all
yeah.
want to be. So it's understanding what those inputs can be, and it sounds like your tenants listening groups and the circle, the speed dating things are all part of building those relationships back again,
So,
into the
yes.
community, understanding across groups, so that you're not just speaking for yourself when you're at a meeting, but you're speaking on behalf of a whole other lot of other people, and you're able to hear other opinions that are not your own, and hold them and appreciate them and find a way forward together. The truth is that in our communities that are experiencing this level of dysfunction, the amount of things that need to be done is so massive that if we spend the next 5 years or 10 focusing only on the things that everyone agrees on, will make massive strides. And in that, because everyone agrees that the local parks should be better, that the litter should be collected, that the place should be safe, that it should be lit well, that there's a few people would say to you, I don't think that the community should be cohesive, or that you should have a sense of community spirit in your neighborhood. So there's loads of things that we can be doing to that everyone will agree on, which is helping to nudge the community towards a place where they can begin to believe again that there is hope for their community, that they can look out for each other, that they can get joy from living in this space and looking out for one another. That, I suppose, is where I feel we need to get to, and the things that we've been putting in place, whether that's through the community council in Queen's Park or whether it's through the residents panel in South Kilburn, I think those are the seeds that communities want to try to put in place. The challenge is how to support those groups so that they don't wither on the vine.
Amazing. Yes. Well, we're sort of running out of time, but there were a few points I wanted to pick up on just to sort of reflect back, really. And the first one was, talking about, people have lost trust, they've lost faith, there are real reasons for that. And then we need to create a bridge to how we can look forward. And for me, that bridge is mourning. We do not create enough spaces for human mourning, human grief to be expressed with no kind of like fix it, make, whatever, just for people to say, that was shit. And it hurt. And it disables us. And to just be able to mourn. And so one of the concepts I've come up with and employed in a few places is what I call healing circles, which are just there for people to find humanity, because you cannot change the past. You cannot change the past. And that we've got a whole podcast on forgiveness, which might be interesting to listen to. And then the second thing, when you talked about this program, that very sort of Lord of the Flies thing where the kids end up on a desert island, all end up, first of all, they're all fantastic, and then, it all descends. But you see, I would say that the reason it descends is because the model of debate in our mainstream society sits in something that I call domination culture. And that's what we've been trained in. We've been trained and we are addicted to the processes of domination culture, which are not human nature, but they've been, through our education system, through our employment system, through our hierarchical, punitive systems, people only copy what they've been taught. We watch our government have a government in place and an opposition. I mean, the word opposition itself, sometimes who oppose for the sake of opposing. This whole thing about debating and arguing and being against each other and trying to work out who's right has been indoctrinated into our society. But in the work I do, over the last 30 years, I've proven that that is not human nature. And what I think you're talking about is returning people to our internal love, the love we have for ourselves, our environment, our surroundings and our communities. And how do we find that when it's most important, so that we don't fight each other when resources are scarce? Because when resources are scarce, the thought shouldn't be, I want to make sure that I get my bit before you get your bit, because then you might kill me, actually, if you think that's what I'm going to do. The thought has to be, resources are scarce. How shall we work together to have the least amount of unnecessary human suffering? And I don't know if you've got one or two words, because we're kind of come to the end of our time together, but I'd love to know, what your final reflection is, or just something around this, Fabian.
I think you've summed it up very well. In fact, Maria, I think the need for communities to be able to um, mourn, grieve, express themselves in a way that the current system doesn't enable them to do. It's also, I think, it really important, conversely, for the establishment, whether that's service providers, the police, the NHS, the councils, community organisations and charities like ours, to recognise the role that we've played in that, not necessarily personally, but also to be able to feel as though we can participate in that healing process by owning the failings that we have been responsible for. And I think there's a culture of cover up and defensiveness, and which doesn't help, isn't conducive to that. So I'd say it needs to be met with an equal and opposite kind of vigor on the other side, where both are able to express both their kind of contrition and their kind of their feelings about how they've been treated. But I do think that you're right, that they then need to be able to be supported somehow to move forward, and that perhaps that kind of culture of domination that you were describing it could be part of the reason why so often it does fall down.
Oh, I'm completely sure of it, Fabian. I've seen it so many times, and I've seen the power of bringing a different set of skills to people and then supporting them to use those.
It would be really interesting to hear from you, Maria, or perhaps on another show.
Yeah.
We can explore what some of the solutions to that could look like, what some of the models for challenging that kind of a top-down, power-driven dynamics can look like, and how a community can genuinely be cooperative without being hierarchical. And that, I think, is something which interests me and is very pertinent in the work that I'm doing at the moment. So
thank you. Listen, this has been a lovely time together. It's been great to really go a bit deeper with you, but hopefully we can take this offline and rattle a few cages between us.
That would be excellent, Maria. Thank you very much indeed for having me, and
thanks.
All the very best.
Thanks for your generous sharing. Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye.